hustling, by doing the only thing I knew how to do, doors opened for me that I couldn't have otherwise imagined.
While other people are focused on impressing each other, people like me are winning on LinkedIn. Why? Because it's all about connecting.
I couldn't breathe if I wasn't an entrepreneur.
Welcome to the Startup Gambit, presented by HASTE and Hustle. I'm SHAUNA Arnott, founder and CEO of HASTE and Hustle.
And I'm DEVON Codrington, COO of HASTE and Hustle. Today's guest is George Khalife, VP of US Capital Formation at the Toronto Stock Exchange, based out of Chicago, and host of the podcast, Let's Grab Coffee, which is an awesome podcast, one you should also listen to in addition to ours. Okay, hey, George, welcome. We're very excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Before we jump into things, we're going to have a minute to hear a quick word from our sponsor.
What if I'm not ready?
What if I don't have all the answers?
What if I just keep going?
What if it doesn't go as expected?
What if this setback helps me see the bigger picture?
What if I realize how far I've come?
What if I remember I'm doing the best I can with what I've got?
Today, I'm ready for what if.
Get ready for what if. Meridian, where banking feels good.
Okay, excellent. We are back. Hello, everyone.
Hey, everybody.
What's up?
Welcome, George. It's so good to see you again. It's always nice to see your face. I've been such a big fan of you for as long as I can remember in my business career. And as part of HASTE and Hustle, you've always been so supportive. And so it's great to have a friendly face on here today. And so what I'd love for you to do is just share with our audience a little bit about who you are, what you're passionate about, a little bit about your career, and just some of your background, just to get us started.
Thing. Well, I didn't have the chance to say yet, but first of all, thanks to you both for having me on. I definitely appreciate it. And Shauna, I'd have to reciprocate everything you just said. Been a massive fan of HASTE and Hustle. I think it's also the first event I ever saw Gary Vee speak live in Toronto. So you kind of brought that excitement, and the sexiness to entrepreneurship to Toronto, and I would say Canada. All right, so feel free to use that tagline. All right.
Yeah. I'm going to use that forever.
Just at least, just credits. That's all I'm looking for. Shout outs. All right.
Yeah. I appreciate both notes. Brought the sexiness of entrepreneurship to Canada. George Khalife.
That's the way it has to be, man. No, I definitely appreciate all your work, both you and of course DEVON as well. Good to finally meet you in person, virtually. It all works.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe just a quick background of myself for people listening who might not be aware. So I was born in Lebanon. Grew up in the Middle East half of my life. I always like to start there before getting into the professional side. It's a really important part of who I am today. So that's kind of an intricate part of my story. So after growing up in the Middle East half of my life, different countries, what I kind of call the immigrant roadshow, my parents decided to move to Canada, which was obviously a neat experience culturally. I went from living in Saudi Arabia for 10 years to then moving to Ottawa in 2003. So it was like a completely different planet to me personally when I was a kid. Definitely taught me a lot though about different cultures, ideologies. So that was really cool. And I would say actually a very important part of how I do business now, that kind of openness, the ability to understand different people. So that's why I just bring it up. It was very critical to my upbringing. Grew up in a world of bankers too. My dad was a practicing treasurer. So he's, worked for some of the biggest banks like RBC as an example, internationally. And so I grew up in the world of finance. And ever since I was a kid, nobody thrust it on me. You know how immigrant parents could be sometimes. My dad was never like, you should be in finance. But, kids sometimes model their parents indirectly, right? And so I always thought it was so cool to see what he was doing. And I kind of just fell into it naturally. The thing I didn't know at the time, especially in university when I studied finance, was how the pressure of being two things if you study finance, right? It's investment banking or consulting. That's kind of the thing. You have to take your CFA. And I'm like, I think by my fourth year of uni, I just knew that wasn't the path I wanted to take. And it's primarily, I think, because I'm Lebanese and my DNA is really sales and marketing. I just I figured that out so quickly. I'm like, dude, I'm a merchant at heart. I got to sell something. I don't think I can take this kind of technical path that everybody should be taking, quote unquote, should. So started my career at TSX, did kind of their associate program, which in Canada is a pretty common thing. You know, a lot of the banks do this. It's a 2-year program, 6 months, different departments. Very important, I think, if you're early in your career and you don't really know where you want to land to start off. So that was really important. Immediately was introduced to the world of entrepreneurship. So behind me, you see kind of where the actual market open is in Toronto with TMX, and seeing companies like Shopify go public in 2015. I was like, what is this, right? Like, what are they doing? How are they raising $200 million? Like, entrepreneurship. What is this kind of community? Because in uni, I wasn't really introduced to it at that time. So it was just really cool to see how tight knit it was. And I just knew then and there in 2015, I'm like, I'm never going to be outside of this ecosystem. Like, I always wanted to be somewhat part of it, spent 3.5 years at TMX, saw kind of the IPO side. And then I'm like, you know what? I got kind of stubborn. I wanted to see what the other exit path of a company is. And that typically is M&A. So getting either acquired or you being the acquirer, right? Aside from you either IPOing or just continuing to grow privately. So joined a boutique M&A firm, which was really cool. And also, I never thought that would happen without a CFA, to be frank with both of you. I only had a bachelor's, still only have a bachelor's in finance. And typically the road to joining an M&A firm is usually a CFA MBA from like a pretty Ivy League school. So it was kind of cool to, grit my way through it and just kind of prove to everyone that you can chart your own course. You know what I mean? It was kind of like a proof to myself as well. And just by building a good network and a brand, good things can happen, even in finance, right? Sometimes it seems impossible. And then finally joined a fintech startup called Owl.co out of Vancouver. Probably the funnest time I've had, to be frank with both of you. These are good friends still to this day, the co-founders of Owl. It's a fintech startup. When I joined them, pre-Series A, seed stage startup, 15 people. It was a grind, but it was a fun hustle, to be honest. And the haste was there for sure. So after I did that, I got you, man. I keep like bringing up haste and hustle. I'll keep doing so within this hour.
Great word choice, George. I love it. That's great.
Yeah. And then just to bring things full circle, I moved to Chicago about 1.5 years ago, rejoined TMX primarily. So my fiance moved here a year before I did, which is the personal reason. But TMX was really bullish in the US, is still, of course, and they wanted to build things in the Midwest. So it kind of worked out perfectly, and I've been here ever since.
That's incredible. Well, I was lucky enough to visit you down there when I was on a work assignment, right as the
at the peak.
The borders were closing, and we managed to have lunch and chat about a few cool things, and then I blitzed back to Canada and I had to quarantine, and oh my gosh, and here we are a year later. Well, that was incredible. What a great story. And I love that you brought in your youth and your background, because I think that is so important. And I think we forget to acknowledge the ways that our family and our heritage mold who we are and how we operate and the values that we have. And I think that is very important. So I love that you brought that up, and it sounded like an incredible time growing up and growing into where you are now. So it's really interesting. So I'd love to just, go right into, I wanted to kind of have a little conversation around raising capital. And, there's so much information out there for founders. And I feel like you don't know what you don't know, right? So you can kind of just pick and choose all this information, and sometimes you find the right information, and sometimes you find the wrong information. And I think I see so many founders who are just like, all over the place. Their heads are spinning with this information, and it's such a hard thing to kind of navigate. So I think if you can sort of shine a little clarity onto some of the stages and things like that, but I'd love to just start there and then talk a little bit about the further stages along and what it means to IPO and how to get prepared for that and those sorts of things. So I think that will be the meat and potatoes of our conversation. So my first question is, what are the key actions a startup needs to take in order to prepare to raise capital as they're, just getting going? What should they be thinking about and doing?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's a really good question, right? And I think to maybe start with that, it's kind of like what you were saying, Shada. There's so much to know, right? I think it's kind of the starting point. 2, it's you don't know where to start. And then the third more important part is you don't really know who to trust. I think that actually is the hardest part, especially when you actually need capital in it. I think because we use it so much in our industry, DEVON raised $2 million. Like 2 million, because we use it so frequently, it doesn't sound like a lot, but still at a very early stage of a startup, it's still a pretty critical number. And then you got to figure out what to do with it. So I think those are three typically challenging things to start with. And on top of all of this, like you could be an operational CEO, you could be a technical CEO. And depending on what you're trying to solve, like you might be in life sciences, you might be in technology, whatever the sector is, you have to not only grow, run your business and survive the first 2 years, which we all know is the most critical and where most startups fail. You have to grow, lead a team, and convince people to leave high-paying salary jobs to join you for what seems to be only an idea on a Kleenex or a tissue paper. So it's very difficult. And then you got to think of this whole capital raising thing that, you might never have done before. So I think those are sort of the realities that often don't get talked about. Because when you see TechCrunch articles, it's always they raised, not what it took to raise. How many articles as a ratio do you see? Right? Because it's not clickbait worthy. Unfortunately. So hopefully we can shed light here. But I think some of the things to note, and I'm sure if someone listening is from the VC side, you probably have deeper experience. But I think just from my time within the ecosystem, what I've seen is, I think as a starting point, it's always important to have an action plan. It's not enough just to say like, I want to raise capital. I think, to start, it's having an action plan around, number one, what type of investors make sense for the stage of company that you're in now. And by stage, I mean, is this and we're going to go through, I think the stages to your second question, but kind of like what stage of financing, what stage is the company in by maybe metric of employee or revenue size, and also what sector. The sector is actually really important in identifying what kind of investors you have at your disposal. Some sectors, let's say like medical devices, are going to have a different category of investors that they can go after versus, let's say, a B2B SaaS company, which may have much more VCs that they can actually open the doors with. So I think that's the second important part. The third is drafting a list of investors that have funded companies in a comparable situation to you, again, by sector, by size. And that's actually not as difficult as you might think, right? Something as easy as Crunchbase, or if you have a friend with like a pitch book license or something, reach out to them and say, listen, I'd love if you can help me out with a list. Here are a couple of names. Can you just find current or past investors? Right? It's much more strategic because you reach out to them. Hey, Samantha, listen, I'm also in the insurtech space. I know you guys recently did a deal with XYZ company. We're close to that stage. We're not a competitor. We're comparable. I'd love a 50-minute conversation, coffee on me, something of that sort, right? So once you draft a list of investors, important part is obviously reaching out, kind of like with that soundbite I just provided. Following up is critical. I was listening to Andreessen Horowitz's Stanford interview probably like 2 days ago, and I've re-listened to it a couple of times, and I think they said they get like 4,000 decks a year, if I'm not mistaken, if not more. So the follow-up is important because you're not the only company trying to raise money. And I think if you're a good company reaching out to a good investor, 9 times out of 10, 100 other companies are doing the same thing. So it's important to be persistent. Learn from the no's. You're going to get naturally just a lot of no's for very different reasons. And I think it's also like, don't miss out on the opportunity to actually ask an investor post to that. Kind of like if you get declined for a job opportunity, it's important to know the reason, because if it actually might be very critical to your pitch, it might have been something to do with your readiness, right? Or just as simple as like, listen, it's not a fit. It doesn't fit with our thesis. But it's at least it's important to know, so you can cross it off your radar but actually know what the fact was, and I think the three other things is be thoughtful about what you're trying to raise, like the amount. And believe it or not, I've really ran into many companies to this day, some that are much more advanced, some are repeat founders. They're going for a financing and that number is still to be confirmed. But you can't really launch a process of raising financing if you don't really know what the amount is and what you need it for. It doesn't make sense, right? So know the use of proceeds, know where they're going, have a clear pitch, and be ready internally. Expect investors are going to ask for like a data room, which is this, it's like a cloud-based platform where you dump all your documents in a secured fashion. you give them access to, they're going to want some of these things. So if you come off the bat, you don't have a pitch deck in place, you don't have the financials, you don't have a dashboard, when the time comes and they're going to ask for it, if those things aren't ready, you can actually miss an opportunity post them giving you that open door. So those come to mind.
That's right. I think that's very important. And I see a lot of, around the thoughtfulness of what you're raising, I see a lot of founders who are, under asking, and then I see some who are over asking. And right. I think it does take a lot of, it really does come down to the data and what your projections are looking like, and having a really good concept of the numbers. So I think that's very important. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great advice.
And this too, Shauna, this doesn't just apply to startups raising. Like, how many times have, you approach sponsors as an example for events? I think the same could be true for different initiatives around capital raising, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You can attest to that.
Yeah, anytime you're asking anybody for money, fundraising, any of it, it has to be a thoughtful number. And I think the things that go into that are, you have to understand where it's going and what the return is for the investor, and be very mindful of those things. And, I think some people get caught up in the idea of, they have all this money, they're just going to, give it to me because they have tons of it. And that's actually not true. It's quite the opposite, I find. They're very careful, and they're very process oriented and detail oriented around the people that they are giving it to, because this is it's essentially a little bit of a, like you're going to a casino, you're gambling a little bit. So, very carefully and mindfully, but part of being mindful is understanding all the metrics. And I think that's where we forget to have that prepared. Yeah. So I think
a good grasp on that, it like having the requester having a good grasp on that is a clear indicator of, I think, how they approach all things. That level of detail is in place, then if they don't know, then I think that's probably something of a red flag that we'll probably get into. George, just listening to you talk, it's interesting because I can tell you have that entrepreneurship background. Like you kind of speak holistically about what we're talking about here. You kind of gave the key actions and whatnot, but then you have a great grasp of like what it looks like on the other side as well. And I'm not sure exactly how many VCs, how many like financiers, like institutions have a good understanding of that, which is like, okay, that clearly shows you've got that entrepreneurship spirit and you understand things, even making the connection, saying to like, it's just like looking for sponsorship. I'm like, yes, that's exactly what I was thinking. Being COO, thinking of the practicality of things. Exactly. Yeah, what do you, with looking at this, like, what do we think are the initial stages of raising capital? I know you kind of touched on a little bit, and I was thinking, of course, answer how you wish, but like, what's step one? You kind of mentioned some things, but is there like official stages? And even sometimes we kind of see like pre-seed, round one. Like sometimes we hear that and we think we know what it means because we've seen that Crunchbase, that TechCrunch article, but it's like, we don't actually know. And the practicality of things is where the work really gets done. And I think sometimes we gloss over that, but can you kind of give us a bit of insight into the actual stages?
Yeah, certainly. So I guess there's a couple of, to your point, like common stages that we might read about or know about. I think even before like looking at raising financing, I just wanted to mention that there's also a stage called bootstrapping, right? Yeah. So bootstrapping is more commonly referred to as self-financed. So either from your own net worth and maybe just for the beginning stages of a business. And then post that, it generates cash flow, it's revenue positive. So you rely financially on the business to self-finance itself versus seeking outside capital. That's what we're talking about. So that's actually a stage that I think doesn't get talked about as much. And, again, Lebanese background, if I go to my cousins and say, hey, listen, I'm starting a business, still not 100% sure of what the product is going to be, but here's the idea, and I raised $2 million, I swear to you, people would think I'm insane, or they'd book a one-way ticket to the US or Canada and be like, we have it very wrong here, man. Like if I'm not really sure how you're able to do that, but where we're from, traditionally businesses are supposed to be generating revenue, right? I mean, that's, I guess maybe by definition, what businesses are supposed to do. So bootstrapping is one that I think is always not maybe thought about as much, right? And by bootstrapping too, what I mean is like try to be as resourceful as possible in the first stage before you even think of friends and family and the other ones we'll get into. Just think about, when we were building Bookback, which is it was an app for students to buy and sell books. We self-financed it with ourselves. My two co-founders were developers, so we didn't have a lot of dev costs. We had some costs around like graphic design, the wireframes, a bit of marketing spend, but we really tried to bootstrap as much as we could. And I just relied on my network, the one I've been building for the past 8 years, the one I've been, providing value to, growing meaningfully. Now I would reach out and say, I'd love it if you can share or leave a review or use it, give me your feedback. There's a lot of that early, that I think isn't leaned upon as much before thinking about raising capital. Because as soon as you go down that mix, it's a very different type of business. You have different pressures and you have different expectations, right? And I also think, honestly, it kind of takes the enjoyment of really building a business in that scrappiness sense, before you get to that stage, And I feel like it's, anyways, sorry. I'll
I heard,
here.
I heard.
No, don't. You're fine. I love it. It's all good.
I heard Jason Calacanis talk about this one time, and he was saying that, it's always so appealing to invest in companies where they have bootstrapped and put in their own. It makes them that much more appealing because that they're fully invested in this. It's not just like some idea they had and they think it's so great. And, it really is something that they've put already money, blood, sweat, and tears into. And so when you go to an investor, when you're ready, you're that much more appealing because you've really put that in already. So I think that's great. A great place to start.
Exactly. And I think what ends up happening to continue on that point, post bootstrapping, that I guess that the next natural stage, and I just want people to know, I'm not here saying raising capital is bad. I'm just saying there's a time for it and it should be intentional. It shouldn't be like the first kind of a milestone you reach just because you think you should. And the first one typically is what maybe the industry calls kind of like a blood round, or sweat and equity, I guess, is our other terms. It's basically like
sweat equity is the term I've heard.
Right. It's like friends and family, basically, right? Your uncle, your aunt, your parents, maybe your sibling, or yourself, right? Through your savings. And that friends and family initially is typically like 5,000 to 100,000, somewhere around there. And if you think about why you're actually raising that amount, well, it's typically because you want to get something off the ground. You're basically taking an idea that you have and internalizing it into at least a minimum viable product. Something that it could be a demo product, it could be a draft version, but just something that people can start seeing visually and kind of understanding conceptually what you're trying to get to. That's probably the initial stages. Maybe it's to hire some development help or support, stuff like that in the initial stages. Probably the riskiest, which is why you want to go to your friends and family. I mean, it's also more emotional because, again, it's your friends and family and it's their hard-earned money as well. Some people literally take it out of retirement funds just to support family members. So it is critical. You have to be serious. Again, my point, it's actually more critical than any other stage, because you also have to remember, as you go along these stages, it becomes easier for other investors. This is why, by the way, whenever a startup is looking to raise money, if they don't have a lead investor secured with like a term sheet that's signed, raising money is going to take a bit longer. Everybody's waiting for that lead. So as soon as, let's say, DEVON and I are raising money, SHAUNA comes in as a lead. If we go to, let's say, Nick as a second investor, well, it's much easier when there's already a name that did the due diligence, is comfortable with the story, right? But taking that first bet is the hardest one. So, I guess the second stage, once you do that, now you're starting to go to more external outside investors. Typically, that's what, DEVON was referring to as either a seed round or a pre-seed. Really, the only difference is the amount, pre-seed being a bit smaller, a seed round defined as like $100,000 to $500,000. Most of that money, though, is being raised by angel investors. And angel investors are really just like high net worth individuals. They could be entrepreneurs, they could be corporate individuals, and they could be traditional investors. Like all they do full time is cut small checks into many companies, like a Jason Calacanis, who was a seed investor in Uber, as an example, Robinhood, which just went public. So now you're trying to grow the business. You're gaining kind of this like proof of concept. You're building the product. That's at the seed stage. Still super early. Typically pre-revenue companies are doing this. Early management. The whole bet here is solely on the team itself. I mean, the team conversation is important in every stage, but definitely more so at the seed stage. The next stages start to delve into that institutional part, probably the more exciting for a company, of course, because for the Series A and B, although they're early stage financing, usually 2 to 5 million, depending, of course, on where you are. California, a Series A could be 10 million, right? Who knows? But for the most part, we're talking 2 to 5. This is really to fund a year, 2 years worth of operation. You can spend some money on development. You can spend some money on marketing and sales, growing the team. That's kind of what this is for. And then the later stages would be Series C and D, typically 5 to 20 million. Now you're introducing strategics, corporate venture capital firms, as an example. Like, for instance, P&G could have a VC arm. Motorola could have a VC arm, right? Allianz Insurance, they invest in insurtech companies that are kind of accretive to what they're trying to do, but they don't want to build it in-house. So that's kind of everything post that could be public financing, like public capital on the capital markets, and we can get into that.
That was amazing. That was awesome. I love the breakdown. Thank you so much.
That was actually, even though I've been doing this, it's always nice to hear how people understand it. And even I was like, oh, there's and what was really cool is the distinction that you said about in California, like, Series A could be 10 million. The numbers change based on where you are. So, that also has me thinking about, the opportunity and what that means locationally for people that are trying to invest, and it's like, where do we see that investors are just not getting that exposure? Do people have to invest with people locally? Do they look everywhere? Is that a trend that matters, or does it not? And kind of who's affected there? Like, have you ever seen anything like that where locationally people will try to think, well, can we tap into this market for greater opportunity and move operations? Is that something that people want to consider, or should they just kind of stay where they are and do what they're doing?
It's a good question. I think this is also something that both VCs and founders have talked about a lot in the past. Toronto, by the way, is very similar to Chicago, right? We've had this thing on our shoulders where we don't need the US to help us grow. We can do this internally. And there's also different opinions about this. I think we're definitely doing a better job now. Chicago has that same mentality, Midwest, connecting the coast. Like, we don't need Cali and New York. There's a bit of that. Mm-hmm. At least from what I've seen, having worked in Canada and the US for the past year and a half, the US definitely has more access to capital. That's the truth. And I'll give you a quick anecdote to describe kind of the difference. In Q1 of 2021, Canada alone, this is all of Canada, the VC amount that was raised was roughly $2 billion. In Q1 alone for Chicago, that's, obviously one state, that was 2.78 billion. That's not factoring in California and New York, which are even larger hubs, as you guys know. So you're dealing with a much larger pool for capital, pool for talent. That's the truth. I think kind of, especially post-COVID, to answer your question more directly, DEVON, is I think the barriers have lessened. Mm-hmm. I think also what's happening is there's kind of there's been a shift of talent too. A lot of folks from Cali are going up to, let's say, Ohio, because it's cheaper to work there. It's cheaper to operate. You're seeing companies even in the US operate out of Halifax, as an example, because they get subsidies. So I think geography is less important physically, because people are cutting checks regardless of where you are. They want to see quality businesses. And also the truth is, you're going to find a lot of hidden gems where people don't look. If everybody has their eyes set on Snapchat, you might be missing on Uber right next to you, or you might be missing on Cameo, let's say in Chicago, which recently became a unicorn as well. Fantastic story.
Yeah, totally right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and to add to that, I think it's very important to really understand the geography of where you're, raising capital or where you're setting up your shop, because there's things like opportunity zones that, provide tax benefits, or even just different states or countries that provide different financial benefits to you. It's a matter of where you're at in your stage of your business. Obviously, a small business is not quite in that position, but as you grow and want to expand, if we're a Canadian business, it's essential to expand into the US and into other markets, because as you said, they're just so much bigger. But I think, basically this entire line of questioning is just speaking to me in a sense that if I was a founder, I'd be desperately seeking out this advice from the people who know, from my local government officials, from the VC world, from wherever I can get the information. And because there's, as you mentioned right at the beginning, there's so much to know, and there's so much you don't even know you don't know. And we're basically not even scratching the surface. I mean, you're providing some great information, but it's, you're directing people to understand that they need to find out more information. And I think that's really important. So,
well, it's critical to seek it out too, Sean. Like, I think you made a great point there, right? It's available. And you have, even if it's like a meetup, like Haste and Hustle, an event that you guys put on, I feel like connecting the dots, but being proactive about it too. People aren't going to raise money for you. It's part of it. It's what you sign up for. And if it's something you need, you kind of have to spend the time studying it. Again, you don't have to be an expert, but I think just knowing what options you have is something I always talk about as well. And even at the group with TMX, is something we always promote.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Okay. Well, just moving along here a little bit, I want to be mindful of your time, and I want to get into some of the later stage stuff too, but let's just finish up a little bit around raising capital. So when a founder is, starting out and they're looking for these things, are there a few critical questions that they should be asking of a VC when they're, sort of interviewing them for this process, just to start with them?
Yeah, no, I really like this question, because usually, I think it's asked in reverse, but I think equally important, again, just like if you're seeking any job, you should have some thoughtful questions lined up for a recruiter. So thank you for putting this together. Quick questions here. And please, by the way, as Shauna is mentioning, like, this is surface level. So I do recommend going deeper on some of these things. I'm just providing direction. Some of the things I would think of is, does the VC lead? And why that's important, I think already kind of alluded to this, because if they do lead, getting other investors to fill up that financing round becomes much easier. So an important thing to ask upfront. Another one is, do they take board seats? And if so, the percentage, but also I think what's more important here is kind of the reputation of the VC, and are they actually going to be providing time and strategic advice, the critical help and support you actually want, right? Strategic capital is always better than just financial capital alone. And sometimes vice versa. Sometimes you just need a ghost investor who isn't micromanaging the operations or the day-to-day. Depends. Every startup is different, and you have to make that decision. Another important one too is, like, is there room for follow-on funding? You often hear this at times, and usually it's given by way of a ratio. They'll tell you, like, listen, we'll provide $1 million now, and then in the future round, we'll provide $4 million as a follow-on financing. Obviously important to know, especially as you start thinking about, again, the one thing I want to leave maybe as a key message here is have the end in sight, work backwards, right? It's always easier to do that. What are the reporting requirements? Some VCs, require like a weekly report, updates. Some are monthly, some it's over lunch. Understand really what those diligence requirements are from your perspective to communicate, right? What we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. Some VCs I've heard, they don't want to hear anything you're doing right, because that's why they've invested with you to begin with. All they want is an email of what you're not doing right, where you're facing challenges, so that they can help you. So it's important to know that. How would they handle potentially competitive situations? Keep in mind, VCs get opportunities all the time. If I'm an insurtech or fintech, the VC gets something that's comparable to mine, and maybe we're not colliding today, but maybe a year from now, we're colliding for the same opportunities. How do you handle those situations? And I would just say the other two is, like, what's their history? Do some due diligence on them. Ask founders, like, what's the culture like? Are they nice to be around? Do they treat you well as well? Again, it's not just about the check. This is a win opportunity. They're investing in you for a reason, and you're investing in them for a reason. So be very intentional. This isn't just, a personal friendship, or like, that's important, but this is also business. And so you kind of have to remove the emotional aspect and be neutral about your decision.
That's great. Such solid advice. I love how it's kind of empowering the founder to think about, we're not just here just trying to get this in at the whim. Like, you want to make sure it's a good fit. Like, this is a relationship that's got to go forward. And if it's not lining up, it could totally be impending to like what you need to create. So, and I really like the point about certain VCs asking, only for what's going wrong. But that being said, I'm sure that there are VCs like a lot of the times it's focused on what the founder is doing wrong, because the founders are the ones going out there and getting the no's, you know, like no,
Right.
no, 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 till they get to the one. So, but you know, not everyone is awesome. So I'm sure there are some things on the VC side that are just not that great. I've heard stories about people like showing up, the VC showing up late for a pitch meeting, you know, like asking questions 2 seconds in before hearing anything, being like, great, leaving early. And, you know, like I've heard of all sorts of different things. So mainly on Twitter, it's pretty crazy. But, you know, like what are some red flags to look for that you might want to avoid maybe on the VC side?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. And again, I want to preface something that, you know, although, listen, there are going to be bad apples in the VC space, the angel space, in the capital markets. We try to weed them out as best as we can. And I don't think inherently VCs are out there to get founders. That might be the case sometimes. It's unfortunate. But for the most part, at least in my experience, they really do care about founders, whether it's the VCs, the capital markets being on the public side. You know, we're usually founder first. And I think to have an ecosystem that wins, you also need successful case studies. Think about Shopify, think about Wattpad, think about Clearco. How many times like the Globe highlights them, or that we use them in podcasts, or we highlight them as case studies in universities, right? Like it all kind of ebbs and flows, and you hopefully you want that kind of intention as a preface. To answer your question, a couple of things I would think about, and there's a lot of really good articles on this, by the way. Again, happy to reference which ones these are. One I read really recently, actually, which I want to give a shout out to, is Timia Capital. They put together 14 terms that can ruin your startup if you're raising money. Check it out for sure. Some of these points are actually from that as well. And some of the things I've heard, one is kind of majority seat on the board. Just be careful, right? Be careful when you're raising, specifically the later tranches of financing. Mm-hmm. How much control are you giving up to an investor? I think that's obviously the most common one. The other very common one is liquidation preferences, right? So very quickly, basically what liquidation preference means is that once the company receives an opportunity for a sale or another liquidation event, i.e. going public, whatever the case is, a liquidation preference is typically described in terms of a multiple. So it would be like 1 time, 1.5 times, or 2 times. Once you see like a 1.5 or 2 is typically where you should be a bit more worried, because basically in layman's terms, what that means is the investor is entitled to $2 for every $1 they invest. That's essentially what's happening. And they're entitled to that amount before any other shareholders get paid. I've seen this firsthand on the M&A side when, let's say, a founder, I'll give you a very quick example. A founder is doing $1 million in revenue, okay? They're thinking of selling the business. They're probably not going to get more than $5-6 million for the business itself, depending on that situation. That same founder has raised $5 or $6 million. That same founder in this situation likely is going to walk away with nothing. Again, not the story that you often hear is celebrated, but one that is very commonly seen, you know? So just something to be worried about. Other things are veto rights.
Oh, so sorry, George, I hate to do this just before you get to the next point, but considering you went for an example for that one, you were talking about the amount of ownership that a VC might look for. What kind of percentage of them, on your first point, that you would come to expect in terms of like, are we looking at, is 10% agreeable, is less than that, you know, just to put some metrics to some of these? And yeah, sorry to make you go back to the first point.
Not at all. It's a fair point. You know, it kind of depends. Unfortunately, these things are very variable, right? To the stage of a company, what kind of, I guess, cycle they're on in terms of financing. But typically, it's in that 20 to 30% is not uncommon to see for the, I would say, even from the seed to Series B. It also depends who you're raising from. But that's what I would say. And then the later stage financing, it's not uncommon to see even up to the 50, 60, 70% ranges, right? Where the equity that an actual founder controls is in the 10 to 15 to 20% range. And the rest is owned by maybe employees, as an example. Depends, right? On the public markets, typically companies float 20% of the company. So it really is variable, but I think those are some of the ranges to answer the question. And yeah, the other quick two I would say is veto rights, right? So sometimes these rights can block you from doing things. It could be blocking you from selling the business or block you from going public because it might not be favorable to the investor, right? And then there are things like protection measures from a VC's perspective, like anti-dilution. Like let's say SHAUNA and I will come in at a round that's at 10 million. as a post-money valuation. Then, Devon, you as a CEO, you decide to do something, let's say in a year from now, where your valuation suddenly becomes 8 million because you're not performing in the right way. We have certain protection measures that we might enforce because you're underperforming. There are certain things like that. Obviously, it goes much deeper, but just some things to highlight. I think probably those are the four most common and could be most dangerous things that you really want to be looking out for.
Excellent. You know, a lot of the ones that you stated, that I think they do come at different rounds, and a lot of the haste and hustle audience is definitely, well, it's pretty varied, but on the earlier side, but it's still things to consider because, you know, going forward, you got to be able to think about what might come down the road. So no, awesome.
Wow. Okay, so I love that. I love that Devon's so excited. Hopefully the audience is as well.
We're doing the right thing then.
I love that we've really, you know, delved into, you know, the raising capital, and I know that it's, you know, we could talk for weeks on this, and, you know, as you mentioned, we've just not even scratched the surface. We've had a late conversation about it, but there is so much information out there, and we'll link to some great articles and different things too, and resources in the show notes and whatnot. But what I'd like to do, because we are kind of, you know, getting close to the end of this interview, I really wanted to touch on, you know, what you're doing and how you support companies now. I think it's so important because I think we often forget when we're at the very beginning of our business, we often forget that there is this potential, if we do it right, that we will be looking to IPO, or we will be looking to sell, or, you know, all these, you know, great things that we hope to achieve at one point, I would imagine. I mean, maybe not everybody, but certainly it's a great outcome. So I'd love to start to get that into people's heads a little bit, and start thinking about what are the things that you need to do to start preparing to go public, to sell, to, you know, to have that exit at some point, all those different things, and what that looks like at an early stage. What are you thinking about at that point, and how are you preparing for that and building for it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think it's important too because, you know, again, if you look at Canada's ecosystem, since the days of maybe some of the not so great tech case studies that we've had, we've also really come a long way. And hopefully that we continue to talk more about it, you know, not just with Shopify as an example. Of course, that's a great one, but, you know, Lightspeed is another really, really great case study. We've seen, you know, Nuvei be one of the largest tech IPOs we've had, TELUS International. Like we're really coming together as a tech ecosystem in Canada. It's no longer this like just purely mining as an example, or forestry or whatever, like historically we used to be known for. It's still super important. Don't get me wrong. It's critical. But we're also becoming known for different things. And it's super exciting to see innovation being at the heart of that. And it's exciting, right? So that's the preface. And I think if you look at Canada's cap markets, very different than in the US. In the US, primarily, if you want to go public, you have two major US exchanges, NASDAQ, NYSE, of course, that do a great job, but they're primarily focused on later stage businesses for the most part. When I say focused, I mean for a company to reasonably go public at the right cost level, at the right, you know, regulatory processes, everything that's involved. That's why you typically see companies with $1 billion plus ticket size go public. And it's also just from exposure. Like to get the right eyeballs, you want to be, you know, the snowflakes of the world, the Bumbles, right? The Robin Hoods. That's why, and these happen on a weekly basis in the US. You know, in Canada, it's a pretty different dynamic. In Canada, we tend to focus on more of the mid-market, and we're beautifully designed for that, you know. And I think why that's great is because, especially in the early stages, it gives companies the ability to go public earlier than otherwise would be expected. So, for instance, to give you quick context, we have this junior exchange called TSX Venture, basically a marketplace where you and I, by the way, can invest in these companies as retail investors. And these are early stage companies, typically valued at like anywhere from 10 to, I'd say 100 million, you know, and they're raising anywhere from 2 to 60 million, typically is kind of the range. So we're talking early stage. They're going public, typically because our requirements, you know, are more easier for their early stage nature. And a lot of these companies that start on venture end up uplisting to TSX or graduate. Quick basketball reference, it's like basically NCAA to NBA. You know, I have to be sensitive about the NCAA stuff because I know they're not maybe paying their their basketball players as much. So
yeah. But that
we've
might
learned
change. That might change.
Hopefully, exactly. That's
things,
the hope. But it really is that, right? It's kind of like getting you prepped for the senior exchange. And a lot of them end up dual listing. So Shopify is a good example, right? Listed in Canada and in the US. So that's kind of what we're trying to build. Is we're trying to build this ecosystem where we can, grow companies into mature, later stage companies. Shauna, you asked about why, or like why would companies think about this, right? Or
Yeah,
kind of
well, you had shared with me a little bit before, and I thought it was so interesting and such an interesting strategy to grow. So I'd love for you to carry on with this line of thinking.
Yeah, so I would say four main areas as to like why companies would think about this. The number one thing is usually they want to raise capital in the form of public capital versus private. It's usually less dilutive for the most part, right? As I said, I mean, companies typically will give up 20% to go public as a float, like in terms of the number of shares. So it's typically less dilutive. The other things to consider are when a company is public, now you have shares of your own company that you can use to actually go out and acquire different companies. That's why you see a lot of public companies end up pursuing mergers and acquisitions, because it's like a combination of cash and shares. Instead of you burning through your runway, you can do a bit of both. The other two is liquidity, usually, either for early investors, maybe the management team has been doing this for 20 years, and it's a grind, like, as you guys know, and having a bit of chips off the table sometimes is nice, especially when you've been doing this for a while. And some of the other things is profile, exposure. Think of especially companies in the consumers facing space, Aritzia as an example, maybe Canada Goose or whatever your cup of tea is from a consumer facing product, Nike. I think those benefit well from being public at the same time, because there is this shift specifically with millennials that really are brand focused investors. We buy or we invest in things that we either use or can recognize. It is a trend, and it's not just millennials, probably Gen Z as well is more on that trend. So that's the fourth probably important part as well.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I remember you talking a little bit about this with me last year when I was down in Chicago, and I thought it was such an interesting consideration that I'm so focused on early stage businesses, so it hadn't even been on my radar. But when you explained it to me, I thought it was such an interesting strategy, and I know that you still have to grow to a fairly significant size to get to that point, but it certainly feels much more within reach. And you're right, it does provide so many opportunities if that's what you're looking for. I mean, obviously there's
it's not right for everyone. Yeah,
exactly.
Sure.
And I think if that's and I wouldn't suggest it for everybody, but I think it's important to understand what your options are. And I think as founders, there's so many ways that we lose sight of all the different opportunities out there for us, because there's so many, and there's so much information. So, well, I know we're wrapping up a little bit. I wanted to just kind of give you a chance to have a little bit of fun and ask you some of our standard questions. DEVON, would you like to do that?
Yeah, sure. Basic question we're asking everybody. So when, I guess, if you could go for dinner, when you get the time, I know you're working a ton, if you can go for dinner with one person, who is your ideal dinner date to go
outside of your fiance? We'll accept that as
sorry.
Thank you so much, by the way. I really appreciate you covering me on that
SHAUNA
one.
saved you there.
If I fucked up on this one, it would be bad.
That, right?
I'm telling you.
Yeah, who's your ideal dinner date to pick their brain and get
listen, funny enough, I was asked this not too long ago, and for some reason I answered like your typical Elon Musk. A friend of mine said Jesus Christ, probably a good option as well. There were like some commonalities. I thought about it a bit more. To be frank with you, it would be my uncle, and it's only because I never got the chance to meet him. Different kind of emotional story, but nonetheless, his name is George as well. I heard great things about him. He was a teacher of history and philosophy, a great guy, always suited up. He just sounded like a very wise individual, and I wish I got the chance to meet him. So if there would be anyone, I think that would be it.
I love that. I think that's such an underrated idea, because I feel the same way. My answer to that is often my grandmother, because for the same reason, she sounded like this very wise old owl, and and she sounded like she had a beautiful spirit, and I always would say the same thing. So I love that you shared a similar thought process there.
Yeah, solid.
If you weren't doing your current role, what would you be doing?
So again, I thought about this as well, and I think to be frank with you, and this is why I do the podcast, I love this world way too much to be away from it. So if it wasn't like TMX, it would either be a startup or a VC, something related to entrepreneurship. And if you're asking me, like, George, outside of entrepreneurship altogether, probably a stand-up comedian or an actor. To be honest.
Amazing.
That's awesome.
If I
we
had
should
nothing
throw
to
in
lose.
radio show host as well.
Yeah, I think you should.
Radio voice.
Yeah.
I probably would have to pay for me, trying to be a comedian. So
this is a good place to start.
Yeah.
I think overall, you've got a wealth of knowledge. You are an entrepreneur. You're a financial expert. I know I kind of throw that term around, but like you've been able to bridge it, and it's amazing. What's your general overarching, like, one piece of advice for entrepreneurs? And this it doesn't have to be outside of what your expertise is, just your overall arching advice. Your one takeaway.
I mean, there are way too many, to be honest. Like, I'll give you just two quick ones. My personal favorite tagline is "Don't let other people's opinion of you become your reality," which I first heard Les Brown say it. But specific to entrepreneurship, I think the most important part, specifically for the community of Haste and Hustle, is give yourself 6 months, right? And by 6 months, I don't mean it has to be 6. It could be 9. It could be a year. My point is, like, give yourself a specific timeline where you truly commit to building whatever it is that you want to build. It doesn't have to be like a life-changing startup. It could be a website. It could be the podcast you've always wanted to build. It could be, getting your content out. Give yourself a timeline, stick to it, and promise yourself, maybe book a calendar invite to actually see what progress you've made in those 6 months. I think we don't often celebrate the small wins, and equally important, so we don't get real with, facing the truth about when things aren't working. Which is why a timeline is so important.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's really good. I love that. Well, I know you have much more sage advice to share. And in that, I think, I'd love for people to reach out to you. And so before we go, if you want to just quickly share where people can find you and to dig deeper into your podcast and your advice.
Well, the Haste fam is always welcome to reach out. Honestly, man, it's like a family to me. So LinkedIn, Instagram, it's George Khalife or Khalife style usually. And the podcast is Let's Grab Coffee. So the easiest, honestly, is probably LinkedIn or Instagram. I'm always reachable. I'll try to get to you as fast as I can. And hope you're all doing well, though. And hopefully I can see you soon. I'll leave it at that. SHAUNA has better news to come, but I think we'll see some good stuff coming out.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we will link those things in the show notes. And thank you so much, George. I really appreciate you being here. And it's always so nice to see you. And thank you so much. And have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, SHAUNA. Thanks, Devon.